Welcome, especially to my subscribers. My name is Chris Burke, the Messiah, a fragile root and a powerful arm. Isaiah chapter 53, 1 through 5. Verse 1. Who has believed what he has heard from us? Good question. Another question. And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Let's deal with the first one. Who has believed? Well, not that many, it turned out, for sure. The early church was made up entirely of Jews, and they provided the only overwhelming leadership for the first century. And God used them to produce almost the entire New Testament. We don't understate that at all. But how many believed in Jesus as the Messiah amongst these people, amongst the Jewish people? Well, not that many. Paul, himself a Jew, wrestled with the unbelief of the people of Israel, calling them my brethren, my kinsmen, according to the flesh, in Romans 9:3. Yet they rejected Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Romans 10 verse 16, but they have not obeyed the gospel, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? There he's quoting from Isaiah chapter 52 verse 15, talking about the Gentiles who came to faith after being completely excluded. So that's the first question. The second is the arm of the Lord. Who is the arm of the Lord? Well, first of all, the arm represents the instrument of power. And so who is the instrument of God's power? This refers to the servant that he's been talking about since Isaiah chapter 52 and verse 13. And of course, the visible power of God was revealed in the form of Jesus Christ himself. He was demonstrably revealed as the power of God through his teaching, his miracles, and his resurrection. Verse 2, for he grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. What you've got here is something very interesting, because if you look at a tender shoot, that's not very strong. And if you look at a root out of dry ground, that's pretty fragile. So you've got this mixture in this prophecy of something that represents the power of God, and yet talking about the same person, it describes him as a tender shoot and a root out of dry ground, the mixture of power and fragility. That's amazing. And not only that, what's happening here is we've got some nuance to metaphors that have been used throughout Isaiah to describe the Messiah. And what is it? Isaiah 4 verse 3, the branch of the Lord. Isaiah 6:13, the holy seed is the stump. Isaiah 11 verse 1, a shoot from the stump of Jesse, a branch from his roots. And then 11:10, the nations will resort to the root of Jesse. And so you've got all of those referring to the Messiah, referring to the fact that the Messiah comes from the lineage of David, Jesse, of course, being the father of David. And then you've got this addition. He grew up before him like a tender shoot. Now, the Hebrew word in this case for shoot indicates something that takes nourishment from a tree. It's a very early form of growth, like a child taking nourishment from a mother. So a tender shoot, which is what the New American Standard uses, with its connection with the tree, is a better fit with the pattern of metaphors, including the root, and provides greater clarity than a young plant, which is favored by some translations. The Messiah represents the power of God. The suffering servant represents the power of God, but from a physical perspective, as a tender shoot, he's vulnerable. Nevertheless, he's under the watchful protection of Yahweh. And then the second part, like a root out of dry ground. The root is like the root of Jesse from 11 verse 10. Now the ground is dry and the root is exposed without access to moisture, and so cannot survive for long. So there's nuance here. This is another indication of the fragility of the position of the Messiah. In this case, the root has been diminished and has degraded over the centuries. There's no royal candidates vying for kingship of Israel in Jerusalem or in Judea. None at all. The lineage is actually represented by this poor working class man, Joseph, and his teenage bride. It's also on the brink of extinction, this lineage, but enough life remains for the Messiah to arrive through it. So what this is alluding to is the fact that there's an imminent destruction of the records which were necessary to prove the lineage of David. And these records would be destroyed in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. And before this, Jesus was able to be confirmed to be from the house of David as written in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Their genealogies could not be challenged as bogus. No one, conversely, on today could be confirmed to be the Messiah from the lineage of David, because those records no longer exist. So, these metaphors connect the Messiah who had come from the Davidic line with the suffering servant as the same person. Many scholars differentiate between the two of them and say the Messiah in the first part and the suffering servant in the second are not the same person, but this links the two, and show that the Messiah is the suffering servant. The latter part of verse 2, he has no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. That's the New American Standard Version. So some regard this as describing his physical attributes, that he was not handsome or an exceptional physical specimen. It's true that he was, in all likelihood, a typical Jew of his day and would not have stood out from other Jewish men by his looks. This might be part of it, but it also fits the absence of royalty in his appearance, which is what the context is indicating. So we take, for example, stately form. Although it's usually used of good looks, we see in Lamentation that it's just used for appearance. Lamentation 4:8, their appearance is blacker than soot. In that case, they don't look good. This is an example of his appearance, and the same for majesty. We've got it's used for God, for example, as Psalm 104 verse 1. O Lord my God, you are clothed with splendor and majesty. Splendor and majesty, stately form or majesty. So you can see the royal connection there, and that appears to be what it's talking about. So the reality is what happened, that Jesus had a lack of status from his Davidic line, and that prevented broad acceptance of his credentials. This is not a Messiah raised in one of the great houses in Jerusalem, educated in the finest institutions of the day, dressed in the finest fashions, and admired by his contemporaries in the capital, recognized from his youth as the Zion of David, and surely the long-awaited Messiah. No, this is not it at all. This is Jesus, raised in an obscure village, Nazareth, in the backward province of Galilee, speaking with a country accent, roughly dressed in the clothing of a man who worked in his hands, a face of someone who had spent his life outdoors. This, Jesus, repelled the educated class, the religious leaders. But as usual, God does not rely on what impresses us to accomplish his purpose. In fact, deliberately the opposite. You can imagine a skeptic speaking to God in the time and saying, Lord, could you not do better than this? Surely he was not your eternal plan. When you looked at Jesus, you did not see royalty, not someone that reminded you of David and therefore anointed as his successor. And yet, he was still the root of Jesse. That's described in Isaiah 11 verse 10. The divine one, the suffering servant, the Messiah, is presented with such accuracy through this prophetic description that it can fit no other than Jesus Christ. This is the way it played out, in other words. Verse 3, he was despised and forsaken by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. A man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, remember those two? And like one from whom men hide their face, He was despised and we did not esteem him. Avoiding eye contact. And when someone is considered as an embarrassment or has failed miserably, and it might be, we might have experienced this ourselves, we are avoided. People don't look at you. You know, if you're a preacher and you preach a really lousy sermon, then people try and avoid you afterwards. That's the reality. The word despised, first of all, is used at the beginning and the end of this verse to emphasize the extent of his rejection. It's a double rejection, not a casual dismissal in the way he was forsaken. They were really done with him. And after his death, expected they'd seen the last of him. And so he was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. The Messiah himself never achieved lasting popularity. By that I mean Jesus, the Christ. He never achieved lasting popularity. In fact, he was rejected first by the religious establishment and then by the people of Jerusalem because they did not fit the conception they had of the Messiah, the Anointed One. Most of the people throughout Judea and Galilee didn't follow Jesus after Pentecost. So this is an accurate description of his overall reception. God constantly displays his power through that which is regarded weak and powerless by man. This is to demonstrate that it's not human power that accomplishes God's purpose. The pinnacle of this demonstration is found in the humble life of Jesus himself. So whose griefs and sorrows did he have his acquaintance? And what was the purpose behind them? Verse 4, surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. So the grief and the sorrow that Jesus carried were not his own, but ours. And what was the purpose behind them? We esteem him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. All right, so we'll get to what was the purpose in a moment. But first of all, we, and that's our representatives on the day, and even today to some extent that's true, none of us, if we'd been there, would have figured this out. We would have seen his suffering as a sign of God's rejection and punishment. Nevertheless, it was for us, our benefit. The fancy word for this is vicarious. He did it on our behalf. He bore it on our behalf. He would achieve God's purpose from saving us from sin, as the next verses make clear. He suffered for us. But this was missed by our representatives on the day, because we would be just like them. So they represent us as well. The Jews and the Romans watched him suffer alone. Verse 5, he was pierced through for our transgressions. It was for us. All this rejection, which would result in our rejection by God, was for our benefit. And now we have not just an explanation of the reason for his sufferings, but a specific moment in the crucifixion. That this is an extra detail. We're getting what happened to him, and we're getting some very special moments that would not be easy to fix. And this is one of them. He was pierced through for our transgressions. To repeat this dramatic point I'm trying to make, it's not just what happened to him, but what he accomplished. The wounds inflicted on him and his death were to heal us from our sins. So he was pierced through. This is a direct reference to the spear in Jesus' side, in his hands and feet. His death on the cross itself was irregular. This is not the normal thing that happened, and part of the reason for this is the timing of his death was in a week that was not ordinary. It was the Passover week, the ideal week to represent vicarious suffering as well. The Jews had asked for the legs of those who were crucified to be broken because it was the day of preparation for that Passover, and they did not want them to remain on the cross overnight. And so in John 19:33, but coming to Jesus, when they saw that he was dead, did not break his legs, and that was an important prophecy as well. Verse 34, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. Verse 5b, we get another specific point that's mentioned. He was crushed for our iniquities, the chastening for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. The purpose of the sacrifice of Jesus was to save us from a sin. We're the beneficiaries. We're the ones healed from sin. But nestled into that description is another act that occurred in the process of the crucifixion. He was not only crucified, but he also received a scourging. Matthew 27:26. And having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. That's Pilate. This is how it's unfolding. What was interpreted as weakness by our representatives was in fact the power of God. The message is the gospel, and Jesus is the arm of the Lord, and by his scourging, we are healed. Thank you for listening. And if this is added to your understanding, please press like and subscribe and share it with others. Grace and peace.